Hello and welcome to Narrowcast Boxing. It's February 4th, 2019. Let's start off with a couple of fights from last weekend. The first thing I want to talk about is that the co-main event for the Sergey Kovalev versus Eleider Alvarez fight started at midnight Eastern Standard Time, which was really late. The setup was also a bit ridiculous because they showed two fights on ESPN. I think Oscar Valdez was involved in that. I didn't catch those two fights. And then they had viewers switch over to ESPN Plus. I was really only interested in the main event anyways, but I did manage to catch Teofimo Lopez. I should say that I caught the final half of the Teofimo Lopez fight. Diego Magdaleno's corner I thought was terrible, and so was the referee for letting that fight meet its obvious conclusion. Uh, that was totally unnecessary what happened. Magdaleno was completely finished, and no one seemed to have the sense or ambition to stop it. One thing I did notice while watching that really kind of put me off and put me off of Lopez was after he gave a really great performance from what I saw. Right after that, he did something that made me dislike him pretty much instantly, and it was just showboating. I thought it was in really poor taste. Showboating to me is more of an art form, and a lot of fighters do it, but not many of them seem to know when to do it and when it's appropriate. If you look at somebody like Bernard Hopkins or Sugar Ray Leonard, they really knew when to showboat. It's part of the reason is to intimidate your opponent, but you also want to get the crowd behind you when you do it. In this instance with Lopez, I just felt like it was disrespectful and, like I said, unnecessary. But I don't really have too many thoughts on Lopez besides that. He looked pretty sharp, nice sharp counters. I would have liked to have seen him kind of up his work rate. He seems pretty comfortable, and I think I would have liked to have seen him kind of put it on Magdaleno a bit more and a bit earlier. It'll be interesting to see where Lopez goes from here. Hopefully he gets another step up in competition pretty soon. I think he definitely has potential. As for the main event, Sergey Kovalev wins a 12-round unanimous decision against Eleider Alvarez. The judges had it 116 to 112. Two of the judges had it that, I should say, and one of the judges had it 120 to 108. I personally scored it 118 to 110. I thought the 116 to 112 scorecards were pretty reasonable. 120 to 108 seemed pretty wide. I felt like Alvarez won at least a couple of rounds, but I don't really agree with that scorecard. As for the fight itself, I thought it was pretty entertaining, although it was definitely more technical. The first four rounds, I thought Kovalev got off to a very slow start, which was unusual for him, but I think it was a good idea. He was boxing well and he was very composed. Alvarez seemed to me like he was looking for a big shot early on. You probably got the idea that if he could land one big punch on Kovalev once again, then the fight would pretty much be over like it was in the first fight. Kovalev seemed to be winning the early rounds just on activity alone, and although I thought he landed a lot of his punches on Alvarez's gloves, Alvarez himself just didn't really seem to be throwing much. It was in round 5 when I thought that Kovalev started to look like he was becoming a bit fatigued, and I thought that Alvarez did a pretty good job of going to the body in this round, but it wasn't really enough for me to give it to him. Kovalev again landed decent shots, many of them against the gloves, but uh, in round 6, Alvarez looked like he hurt Kovalev a couple of times, and this is one of the rounds that I gave to Alvarez. Kovalev landed more punches, but not really the eye-catching ones, and Alvarez seemed to push forward. In the 7th and 8th round, it was pretty much what we had been seeing up to that point, except both fighters were looking pretty weary, although I felt Kovalev was again outboxing him, and he just seemed to be outboxing him, outworking him, and really outthinking Alvarez. One thing that I did notice was Kovalev looked really dead tired prior to coming out for round 9. Although round 9 was pretty much the same story, it was basically just a one-sided fight overall. Kovalev just outlanding, outworking Alvarez, and I thought in the last 3 rounds Kovalev finished strong and he looked aggressive like his prior self. Um, Alvarez just really didn't do much in the fight. He didn't really take the fight to Kovalev like I would have expected him to do. And I think in the last round, Kovalev looked like he was winning the round, and he also seemed to be going for the knockout. So I did give Kovalev a chance to win this fight in my video last week, which nobody watched, but that's okay. Um, I did give him a chance to outbox Alvarez, but I wasn't really thinking that that would be the outcome. Uh, I pretty much expected the same fight that we got the first time around. That clearly didn't happen. Kovalev made the proper adjustments between the first fight and the second, and I think part of the credit goes to his new trainer, Buddy McGirt, and Kovalev proved that he was a better boxer than Alvarez. I think that Kovalev should be very careful about who he fights next. He did put out a good performance, but some of the same problems did come back, particularly his stamina. And when he got hit flush by Alvarez, he was noticeably hurt, at least a little bit. So it will be interesting to see what happens with him going forward, but I don't think he should fight the likes of Marcus Brown. I think Dimitri Bivol would be a handful. We'll just have to wait and see what happens with his career. As for the fights this week, there are 4 major championship fights which feature the likes of Alberto Machado, Rey Vargas, Jose Ramirez, and Gervonta Davis. I'm probably only going to watch the Gervonta Davis fight if I'm being honest. I know that Abner Mares had to pull out of the fight due to injury, which was unfortunate. I would have liked to have seen that, but it is what it is. I would have picked Davis in the fight, and I'm picking him to win against Hugo Ruiz, who's his replacement. I'm unfamiliar with him. Davis is clearly very skilled and has the power to go with it. I think he's a must-watch if you're into boxing. The other guys that I mentioned don't really grab my attention, and the problem with all of these fights, in my opinion, is that the champions are facing guys who I've never heard of before. It's just that as a viewer, I don't really have any idea if the opponent is a diamond in the rough or a complete knockover job without doing extensive research. I don't really have the time or interest for this. I think I'm just becoming more selective about the fights that I watch because I don't really enjoy watching some fighters, whether it's their style or the matchup itself. So that's really about it for this week. I'll be back next week. Enjoy the fights, and I'll talk to you then.